So, to state the obvious, the West is in very bad shape. Discussing that and debating that point is beyond the scope of this video. I also want to preface this discussion by saying that I, like many on the dissident right, was once a true believer. I believed in the principles of the American Republic. I wanted to expand Western hegemony in the American empire, and I don't think that's uncommon. It seems to me that many on the dissident right today started out, like myself, as vociferous advocates for and defenders of the West. It's out of this love for the system that was, or the system that could have been, that we've come to hate the system that is and look for some sort of solution or replacement. And that, as conservatives or members of the dissident right, is our great failing. It's why we've failed to conserve anything. The right has consistently failed to put forward any sort of coherent plan or solution for the issues we currently face. It's merely resistance to whatever the new thing is that the left is pushing, whatever that new thin end of the wedge is, which they'll eventually acquiesce to in 10 to 15 years. It's tremendously frustrating as well to watch those on the dissident right who have some sort of audience, who have some sort of voice, and who do wield some sort of power, not do anything real with it, just spin their wheels in the mud. You get guys who are more normie tier, like Sargon of Akkad, who point out liberal idiocy, like, yeah, cool. Liberalism is a retarded death cult. We've got it. We're all on the same page. You get guys like Leather Apron Club and his ilk who, by and large, spend their time focusing on things that aren't particularly relevant to moving forward. Like, yeah, it's important to note that a certain subset of the population is disproportionately in control of things, like, great, tracking. Or it's great to talk about how the Greeks and Romans weren't, like, some sort of homosexual empire. Or you get some of these newer guys like Joseph Bronsky and Cremio who want to focus on these more esoteric things or focus on hard numbers and data points. And don't get me wrong, I'm not meaning to right bash here. By and large, all these people are very intelligent guys who are on our side. And generally the things they're talking about are to some degree of some import, but dunking on the libs and trying to pathologize things and simply informing the general public isn't enough to get any real meaningful change. If we, the dissident right, can't take all this hard work and important stuff that's been discussed by the aforementioned people and people who weren't mentioned as well, and channel it into something useful, channel it into trying to achieve whatever comes next, it's all for nothing. It's meaningless. It's just hot air. And the few we have on our side that have put forward any sort of plan or any sort of solution, I mean, it's not super promising. You get guys like Devin Stack who tell you you've just got to, go to the hinterlands and build a homestead and, raise the next generation who's going to put an end to this. Like, all right, that's a plan, that's a solution, but it really smacks of what the boomers did, which is just kick the can down the road on this sort of stuff. You get these accelerationists who truly believe that there's no political solution here, and they're off in the boonies too with $40,000 of rifles and kit, waiting for some sort of apocalyptic collapse that's probably never going to come. And even if it did, they wouldn't come out on top. And mainstream conservatism is probably the dumbest of the options, which is just trust the plan, guys. The great republic put in place by our forefathers is still intact. It's still functional. We just got to put the right Supreme Court justices in place and elect the right people, and it'll all fix itself one day. And I know that wasn't the most charitable interpretations of what they're suggesting, but it's what it essentially boils down to. Again, I'm not unsympathetic to any of this. I recognize that the American Republic once was great. I enjoy a good video dunking on the libs. I enjoy content about human biodiversity. I, like most men, was once a boy with a warrior spirit that sort of fantasized and daydreamed about retaking the nation via superior martial brilliance and force of arms. But to save the West or to fix the West, it doesn't need boys. It needs men. And I think that maturity is realizing that these solutions, as commonly envisioned, are folly. The collapse probably isn't coming in the way you think it is. The Republic was great, but it led to the situation we're in now. To think that we can trust the current system or to hope to roll back the system to a different time where things were better is just foolish. It's like a cargo cult. You can't simply mimic things to get a desired result. We also can't just despair and give up. And I've been there too. I've been black-pilled myself. But fact of the matter is, whites have always been a minority. And still, we achieved greatness and developed great systems. And furthermore, a much smaller minority seems to control things in the West. Numbers can't mean everything. There is a solution. There is a viable path forward if we're simply strong enough to walk it. And not only do we have to be strong enough to walk it, but we have to be smart enough to see it. I'm not sure I've got the best solution. In fact, I'm sure I don't. But I've got a pretty good start. I genuinely hope that what I'm about to lay out sparks some discussion and perhaps gets the ball rolling on the dissident right coming up with and getting behind some sort of coherent plan. First and foremost, before you can even think about doing anything on the grand scale, you 100% need to take care of your own material conditions first. Get fit. Find a good career that's going to pay you decent money. Find a wife and have as many children as you can. Get as self-sufficient as you can to whatever degree you're able with respect to food. And relocate from essentially zones that are hostile to you and your people. I don't know that you have to up and relocate across the country. I don't know that you need to even go to the hinterlands out in the woods, but certainly get out of the city. Get out of blue counties, and by blue, I mean demographically challenged counties. You need to get yourself to a safe place where people like us still wield a degree of institutional power, even if it's just local governance. Once you've got all that out of the way, we can start tackling larger issues. Now, an important consideration here with respect to governance is understanding that the West is sick, and it's not just sick by chance. It's not like you and I just by happenstance catching a cold or the flu. The West is sick because it was poisoned, and it was able to be poisoned because the whole environment has been compromised. Specifically, as I see it, I've been able to trace this compromised environment back to really 3 key factors. The first being the expansion of the franchise, the vote. The second being the subversion of the legislature. And the third, and probably most important, is the judiciary as a whole, specifically the Supreme Court system. I've heard it said that men get the governments they deserve, and I think that's kind of apt, especially in this situation. Everything is downstream of the electorate in this country. The founders of this country, and almost every country in history, recognized that the average person having a real say in governance of the land is not a good thing. While the Constitution did not originally dictate exactly how the franchise should be handed out to the people broadly, the Constitution did state that the times, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. Generally, those legislatures determined that the people who should be able to vote were free white men who proved they could own and manage property. And even if states didn't explicitly state that, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which limited citizenship to free white persons of good character, in practice made it so that only free white persons of good character could vote because they were the only ones who were citizens. And not only was this a good thing because, property ownership is sort of a proxy for intelligence, right? In the days before IQ testing. But property ownership also means you have a vested interest, a stake in this country doing well. You're not some sort of immigrant grifter who's here today, gone tomorrow, depending on the economic conditions. When you restrict voting rights to whites, they're necessarily going to vote in their own interests. They're going to do what's best for whites, what's best for their extended kin. This was a nation made by whites for whites, and it's the responsibility of a government to do what's in the best interest of their people, to keep this a high-trust white society. And all other conditions in this country are downstream of keeping this nation a high-trust homogenous society. And you might deny that point, but I'm not going to get into substantiating it here. IQ tests are what they are. Cultural biases are nonsense. The FBI crime table is what it is. Like, it's undeniable at this point. It's in everybody's best interest, including other races, that this nation remain a whites-only nation. And there were other considerations, too, that were so commonly understood that they didn't even bother to codify them. Like, yeah, they didn't feel the need to explicitly say in most instances that Indians would be denied the right to vote. Like, yeah, they bear an allegiance to a foreign power. They're not going to vote. Dual citizenship isn't a real thing. You can't have allegiance to two things at once. And that's just an example. But clearly we didn't go far enough because we expanded the electorate against the best interest of this nation, in part because we left this up to the states, and they began to realize that they could vote for things that were in their own personal best interest, but not in the best interest of the nation, especially as we expanded citizenship to include non-whites. And as you expand the electorate to include a less intelligent class of people, now you get a more gullible class of people voting, deciding the fate of the nation. And so you end up with worse elected politicians. And those worse elected politicians will appoint worse people to the positions that they have authority over. And as time goes on, this dumber electorate, this broader electorate, is causing more and more problems. Now, on down the line, they decide that they themselves want to elect the Senate, not the states, or rather the state legislatures, as one limited example. So then who should be allowed to vote in this new ideal society we're trying to create? Obviously, here in the United States, it would be restricted to white people. That's a given. It should also be restricted to the head of the household, the head of the family unit. One vote per family unit, in effect. You must reside 100% of the time in the United States. No dual citizenship. You ought to be of good moral character. That is to say, you haven't committed any serious crimes. If you have, well, too bad. Your right to vote is revoked permanently. You must have a demonstrated IQ above a certain level. Now, should you have to be 2 standard deviations above the mean? No, that's not a recipe for anything good. But basic competency must be demonstrated. I think requiring an IQ of 100, an average IQ or above, is where we need to be. You ought to be married and never have been divorced. And you also ought to have children, unless you or your wife are medically unable. We have to keep power in the hands of people who have a vested interest in the future of this country, even after they're dead and gone. We also need to restrict the vote to people who are mature but not so old that they're out of touch. Now, I don't know exactly what these age numbers should be, but something on the order of over age 24, under age 70 isn't unreasonable. You should be gainfully employed and not a recipient of any welfare. People who are effectively wards of the state ought not have a say in how the state operates. And we also need to keep this country in the hands of the people who are intended to inherit it, the people who it was made for. And so, while I don't think immigration should be wholly restricted, in fact, I support limited immigration from European nations to include the Anglosphere, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, so on. They're not Americans yet, and they won't be for a few generations. Functioning societies cannot and should not give any political power to those who just moved there like 5-10 years ago. These people still bear an allegiance to their homeland. Don't believe me? I mean, look at all the Mexican flags that are waved around the United States by first and second generation immigrants. It's okay to be proud of your heritage, but you have to be an American first, and that's why I believe that the vote should be restricted to probably third-generation citizens. You can make the argument for a generation either way, but 3 seems like a good number to me. And beyond bearing a simple American identity, you also should be actively contributing to the state, to the society at large. So the vote ought to also be restricted to active or veteran members of a militia or other civil service, volunteer police, volunteer fire, local government board, something like that. Some contribution greater than merely taking care of yourself and your family unit. And as an aside, I think this also helps to curtail a very real phenomenon where the people who would be the best of us to govern and rule are often the least likely to get involved in that sort of way. So it might force the hand of better men to preside over us. Now, as far as Congress goes, I don't know that there's anybody in the United States today that would contest that Congress isn't just a den of the morally corrupt. Now, some of this corruption would be resolved by a single simple thing, that is to restrict eligibility to be elected to Congress to eligible voters. There's a lot in what I just talked about that will curtail some of the ability of the corrupt to wield the reins of power in hand. Now, having said that, it wouldn't be perfect, not even close. Prolonged exposure to power can also lead to corruption in its own right. So, term limits ought to be in order. I'm willing to quibble over an exact number, but a period of 8 years seems long enough to ensure political stability while preventing corrupt geriatrics from driving the country into the ground, as the boomers have. We also need to put safeguards in place to ensure their loyalty to the United States and the United States alone. One of the things I would do is stipulate that there be no foreign business ties for any elected official. That includes immediate relatives. Now, I'm also highly skeptical of those with business interests here in the United States, but in practice, I'm not sure how one could go about excluding them. I also believe that to avoid demagoguery, you need to take away the ability of the people to elect the Senate. But even these restrictions still, in all probability, would not stop some of the corruption that one sees in all governments back to the beginning of time. And so, both to further dissuade the temptation of politicians to become corrupt and do corrupt things, but also to punish and permanently remove those bad actors, I would propose the institution of, for lack of a better term, new treason codes. Now, I'll go into more detail on these in a later video just because I haven't fully fleshed the idea out yet, but there needs to be swift and severe justice administered to those engaging in treason, both in Congress, in the legislature, and to the people broadly. So if you are caught doing things like aiding and abetting illegal immigration or providing intellectual, particularly military intellectual property to foreigners, or selling real estate to foreigners, or taking bribes, or taking corporate kickbacks, or engaging in voter fraud, corrupting the youth, things like that, you shouldn't get fined. You shouldn't just go to jail. You should be publicly hanged as a traitor, and summarily hanged without decades and decades of appeals wherein you sit on death row. This may seem a little harsh or may seem a little draconian, but frankly, to be a traitor is like the worst crime a person can commit. And by traitor, I mean selling out your own people. Consider that we put people to death for simple murder, and rightly so. But in terms of pure utility, the traitor, the person who's selling his own people out for financial gain, or deliberately trying to undermine his own people, does a hell of a lot more damage. Crime in this country too often goes unpunished, or at least not punished enough. Now, within the context of this video, the judiciary is the biggest head scratcher for me. I'm going to be the first to admit that I don't really have a good solution here. I've got a couple of ideas, but frankly and honestly, I'm soliciting opinions on this subject. The most devastating and degenerate and horrible things that have happened to this country have by and large come from a rogue judiciary, a judiciary that feels no real need to properly interpret law at all, let alone interpret it with original intent in mind, or beyond original intent, the best interests of the people. For example, US v. Wong Kim Ark, which was used in large part to make the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship is what it is today in this country. Did the Supreme Court go back and look at the original intent using like the Senate debates and the 14th Amendment, which cover this topic in great detail, to make the obvious ruling that no, this birthright citizenship clause was not intended to extend citizenship to people who are effectively foreigners? No, they just do whatever the hell they want and cite English common law. Brown v. Board of Education, same story. Do they take prior rulings into context? Did they actually make an attempt to interpret the law? No. They just pull a ruling out of thin air which says separate is inherently equal, screw freedom of association, and the southern states, they need to desegregate with all deliberate speed, issuing orders as though they themselves are kings in their own right. Roe v. Wade, same story. Did they cite any relevant case law? Did they cite anything in the Constitution that explicitly states that the states must allow women to get abortions? No, of course not. They write hundreds of pages doing mental gymnastics, trying to claim that the right to privacy is fundamental, therefore women should get to murder babies. Not to belabor the point, but more recently, Obergefell v. Hodges. Same nonsense. Did they look at original intent? Did they look at the actual law on the matter? No, they just contrive some sort of ruling out of the idea that the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment somehow say that we should allow homosexual marriage in the United States. And I could spend hours and hours going through the same sort of stuff. I mean, these aren't unique instances of bad rulings. Where the most important matters in the United States are concerned, we live in a critarchy. And it's one of those things where obviously we need an independent judiciary to interpret law and be the final say, right? Unless you want a civil war every 80 years or so. And there's not a ton of good options to rein in the power of this judiciary, specifically the Supreme Courts, without undermining their independence, without just making them into another smaller legislature. There's no real penalty for poor rulings at this juncture. Really, the best idea that I have is to lower the threshold for the states to initiate a constitutional convention. Perhaps we lower the threshold to 60%, 51% in the case of Supreme Court rulings, and let the states hash it out if there truly are bad rulings. I have to believe that in extreme and egregious cases like the ones I mentioned before, it would have prevented them. Or if not prevented them entirely, perhaps it would have made the courts less bold. And perhaps to further dissuade the courts from making bad decisions, we codify the right to secession with a certain percentage of the population of a state voting for it. It would obviously have to be a very high bar, 75, 80, 90% even, if you want to retain any sort of semblance of a nation. But to me, and I think most reasonable people, it would seem that the right to secession is merely an extension of freedom of association. Now, one branch of government is conspicuously absent from this conversation so far. That's obviously the executive. I don't have a good answer here. I've got a few ideas that I think deserve their own video, so I'll save my thoughts for that video. But suffice to say, the older I get, the more sympathetic I am to the idea of monarchy and a strong, probably hereditary or dynastic executive authority. To sum up my rationale here, it's largely the fact that it would ensure a strong personal connection of the ruler to his nation. It truly becomes his people, his extended family. And say what you want about the potential of tyranny, which I think is a very real potential, they're not going to sell out their own people and their own nation in the way that we in the West have been sold out today. But again, my mind is not made up, and I'm actively soliciting opinions on this matter because it's one we need to resolve before we can move forward. And speaking of moving forward, I've presented an idea for a reformation of the American or Western government broadly. Even if this were a perfect solution, which it's not, the elephant in the room here is, how do we go from where we are now to the system we want to be in? Nobody is going to come save us. It's highly unlikely that there's going to be some sort of catastrophic collapse of the government. A grassroots uprising is just not a viable option. Even if we manage to come out on top, it would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. And even looking historically at successful revolutionary movements, it seems painfully obvious to me that we need to utilize and weaponize the political infrastructure and political system that does exist to achieve our own ends. I don't see a way out of this without us seizing control of our local governments and institutions. And I don't mean violently, because violently in this instance simply won't work. So, assuming you've done the three things I talked about at the beginning of the video, which is namely taking care of yourself and your own material condition, getting fit, getting well-read, making a good living, you're out of these geographical strongholds of institutional power, the way forward from there is this. Everybody needs to be developing a local community. You need to know your neighbors, get on good terms with them, build real connections, bonds, friendships, and try to proselytize, because that's the demographic, the people who want to be around people like you that will be receptive to our message. They're the people who will be easiest to pull onto our side of things. And if and when the hobnailed boot of Big Daddy government either comes to crush you or leaves you to hordes of rioters or something, they're the people who are going to be to the left and to the right of you that you'll need to rely on. Also, everybody, all men at least, should be training to fight as best they're able. And they should see to it that they've got the proper equipment to do so. This may initially seem contradictory to everything I've been saying thus far, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this one because I'm saving that particular discussion for another video, but suffice to say for now that an armed citizenry is a good thing. But not everybody is capable of doing everything. Different people obviously have different skill sets that lend themselves to contributing in different ways. If you've got great business sense and a knack for making money, go out and make a ton of money. Be successful. That's okay. But understand that one of the many things the left does better than the right is funding their political movements. We have no millionaires and billionaires on our side. We desperately need them because everything costs money. We need people to fund and found special interest groups that benefit us. We need money to fund media campaigns and new social networks and fund protests, pay organizers, that sort of thing. If you've got leadership skill and political savvy, go run for some sort of local office. Local politicians, whether it's a school board member or a sheriff or something like that, they wield tons of power. Power to affect meaningful political change. And you just might be able to wield that political power into some sort of higher office, which we desperately need. We need people sympathetic to us working their way up the political ladder and infiltrating and subverting these same organizations that our adversaries have pulled out from underneath us. If you've got talent and aptitude for content creation that would benefit the right, well then go out and do that. Fight in the cyber battle space for hearts and minds. You're probably not going to reach very many people, but every mind you change is impactful. You're probably never going to red pill all the normies, right? But you've never needed to. All you need to do is change the minds of the people who think and do and act. The rest will follow suit. And this cyber battle space is one in which we're losing, and losing badly. Now it's gotten a little better since Elon Musk took over X, and it's a small victory and one we should celebrate, but by and large, ideas such as ours are not welcome anywhere. And because of this, young and impressionable minds are having their minds melted by this left-wing propaganda. The kind you'll see without any opposition on TikTok and Instagram and the like. As silly as it may sound, we need to win there. And all these efforts should be working in concert to one goal. And that goal is a national divorce or separation. The United States and the West, they're too far gone. The demographics are too screwed up. The battle's not lost, but there's a fair amount of necrotic flesh that's going to have to be cut off if the whole thing stands any shot at surviving. It goes without saying that that's a lofty goal, and there's a lot of ground to be covered between where we are now and where we should be. But there you have it. This is a way out. This is a solution. Let's discuss it and hopefully find something better.